The 3 surviving Andromedans vanished into the billowing smoke, leaving behind a sudden, heavy silence. For several long seconds, neither Jim nor Selvin moved. Around them, Chicago Arcology Sector 12 groaned in protest. Distant alarms echoing through shattered streets, while emergency holograms flickered weakly against the drifting haze. On the pavement lay 2 Andromedan soldiers, completely motionless. They were dead, actually dead. Selvin slowly pushed himself up from the cold pavement, his breath catching in his throat as he dragged his aching frame into a sitting position. He didn't look at the sky or the smoking wreckage around them. His eyes were fixed entirely on the heavy iron pistol clenched in Jim's hand, staring at it with absolute unblinking disbelief. Jim remained slumped frozen against the broken cruiser, the old Colt suddenly feeling strangely heavy in his grip as the initial rush of adrenaline began to fade. A thin wisp of grey smoke still curled lazily from the barrel, drifting into the crisp afternoon air as Jim's gaze travelled from the weapon, down to the unmoving alien bodies pooling dark fluid on the street, and finally toward the empty, ruined intersection where the remaining soldiers had just fled in blind panic. "They ran," Jim said quietly. Selvin blinked, stunned. "They ran," Jim repeated, louder this time, the reality hitting both of them at once with absolute disbelief. The invaders, the monsters that made entire worlds surrender, the species that shattered fleets and forced the Galactic Compact to recommend total capitulation instead of resistance, had run. And they had run because of an old handgun. Jim swallowed hard, forcing his composure back into place. He spun the Colt once in his hand, trying very hard to sound calmer than he actually felt, as a crooked grin broke across his face. "Well, good to know the old girl still gets the job done," he said, his voice shaky but amused. Selvin just stared, letting out a long, slow breath. "Huh." As Selvin slowly pushed himself to his feet, he kept staring at the pistol like it had violated the laws of physics. I gotta have one of those." Jim barked a laugh. "Oh, now you want one?" Selvin ignored the jab, suddenly turning his attention toward the damaged commercial sector across the street. There, half hidden beneath smoke and debris, a shattered neon sign hung crookedly from a building, its last word flickering weakly. "Earth Firearms." Selvin pointed. "Do you think that building is still standing?" Jim followed his gaze, and a heavy, dangerous, hopeful realization landed between them. They slowly looked at each other, Jim's expression shifting first. "Hope so." Selvin's breathing quickened as the sheer weight of the math caught up to him. The Andromedans were the conquerors the galaxy bent its knee to, the unstoppable force interstellar governments refused to fight. And humanity? Humanity had warehouses of these things. Collections, ranges, safes, stores, families passing them down like heirlooms. Jim suddenly let out a slightly unhinged laugh. "Oh, they are so screwed." Selvin actually smiled for the first time since arriving on Earth. A tired, stunned, disbelieving smile. "You humans are insane." "Buddy," Jim said, already breaking into a stride toward the range, "that's been on the brochure forever." They moved quickly through the ruined street, broken glass crunching beneath their boots under the cold afternoon light. Far overhead, the alien warships hung across the sky like steel gods, but the mood had entirely shifted. Selvin glanced sideways at Jim as they walked. "You know, I am beginning to understand your species." Jim glanced over. "Really?" Selvin gestured vaguely at the air around them. "This, the weirdness, the sentimentality. You preserve obsolete things. You refuse to abandon old methods. You keep ancient machines because they feel right." Jim smirked. "Damn right." Selvin shook his head in lingering disbelief, his gaze drifting back to the Colt. "Every advanced species abandons the old, but you humans—" He exhaled, something close to wonder creeping into his voice. "You kept metal. He paused, looking at Jim with raw sincerity. "Thank you for saving my life." Jim shrugged awkwardly, looking away. "Yeah, well, couldn't let my only pointed-ear buddy get vaporized." Ahead of them, the firing range came into full view. It was scarred, damaged, its windows shattered and chunks of the exterior blown entirely apart. The signboard swayed slightly in the wind, broken and crooked, but against all logic, the building still stood. Jim and Selvin exchanged one final look, and without another word they stepped inside. The report reached the command deck of the Ascendancy of Order less than 90 seconds after the encounter in Chicago, buried beneath a massive, cascading stream of routine occupation telemetry. On paper, it read like a minor urban disturbance. A brief civilian skirmish, a localized patrol engagement, 2 casualties, and 3 survivors. Initially, there was absolutely nothing about the file to justify interrupting the High Command. 2 dead soldiers on a newly conquered world barely qualified as paperwork, yet the automated threat assessment matrix had flagged the file with a single, highly irregular variable. Cause of termination, unknown. That single word altered the room's atmosphere instantly. The cold blue tactical displays suspended above the central deck shifted as an operations officer stepped forward, a subtle, rigid unease creeping into his posture. "Commander," the officer said carefully, adjusting his data feed. "Sector 12 in Western Hemisphere occupation grid has submitted an irregular casualty profile." The holographic projection expanded over one of Earth's dense urban population clusters, what local records designated as Chicago. The Supreme Tactical Overseer did not immediately look up from the global projection. Clarify. 2 Vanguard soldiers terminated during a standard civilian pacification sweep. A nearby strategist exhaled impatiently, crossing his arms. "Structural collapse of local architecture? A vehicular tracking accident?" a commander suggested. "Improper low-atmosphere landing sequence?" Another shrugged dismissively. "An uncalibrated friendly weapons discharge." The overseer finally turned his cold gaze toward the console. "Cause?" The officer's head tendrils twitched as he looked at the telemetry. "We do not know, sir." The chamber fell silent. The surrounding staff shifted slightly, not out of concern but pure irritation. The overseer's expression hardened. "You do not know?" "No, Commander." The officer hurriedly activated the log, bringing up the squad's raw helmet data. The data was pristine. Personal shield integrity had been optimal. Environmental threat indices remained entirely green. Local civilian signatures were present, along with 2 law enforcement combat profiles carrying standard low-threat directed energy firearms. Primitive by occupation standards and assessed as tactically irrelevant against active shields. Then the vitals dipped. 2 markers, dead. The overseer frowned. A localized equipment malfunction? Possibly, a systems officer offered quickly, desperate for a technical explanation. A localized shield instability, perhaps. The explanations arrived easily, serving as a comfortable cushion against the bizarre telemetry. The overseer cut through the speculation with a sharp gesture. "Show the footage." The overhead lights dimmed as the recorded file took over the main display. Static hissed across the audio before resolving into a smoke-choked urban street. A damaged civilian ground vehicle sat resting against a broken curb while an Andromedan patrol advanced with practiced, cautious precision between the buildings. The squad's threat indicators remained entirely green, minimal risk, no battlefield signatures. Then a sharp, concussive crack shattered the quiet of the recording. It wasn't the high-frequency hum of plasma, the dry snap of a thermal discharge, or the clean hum of directed energy. It was a mechanical, violent, and deafening boom. The lead soldier staggered backward. His personal shield shimmered violently, fractured and collapsed. A second mechanical crack echoed immediately. The soldier's chest armor ruptured inward, and he dropped heavily into the debris. Total confusion erupted across the synchronized squad comms. Threat scanners spun erratically, flashing empty alerts. There was no thermal source to lock onto, no energy profile to track, and no quantum disturbance to pinpoint. There was nothing, only smoke, noise, and a lone human sitting beside a ruined cruiser holding a compact metallic object. Another violent crack echoed. A second soldier collapsed into the street. The remaining patrol members immediately initiated a frantic, disorganized retreat. No one spoke. "What?" a commander finally asked, his voice slow and deliberate. "Was that?" No one answered. The systems division immediately expanded the raw sensor data across the central table, but the threat analysis engine simply returned a wall of failures. The energy profile was non-existent. The thermal signature was negligible. The acceleration index was wholly insufficient by modern Imperial standards. One officer frowned, leaning over the data. "A concealed, low-signature weapon platform." The ridges above the Overseer's eyes tightened, studying the final frozen frame of the video. One local, one-handed grip. Sitting unprotected, holding a small metallic object raised casually toward the squad. No combat armor, no battlefield cybernetic implants, no military identifiers. The Overseer spoke quietly. "The weapon is handheld." A heavy silence spread across the deck. Then, a strategist voiced the very thing everyone in the room was suddenly thinking. A hidden superweapon. A Black Project technology. The room shifted in relief. That at least made logical sense. A primitive world with a concealed defensive doctrine. An unknown, highly classified military asset. Perhaps this planet possessed a unique branch of physics the rest of the Milky Way had overlooked. Something deliberately hidden until the invasion began. The Overseer straightened, his voice sharp with command. "Locate that specific weapon system immediately, and locate the operator." The command room surged into high-tempo activity. "Priority threat classification." "Maximum," the Overseer ordered. "Urban suppression authorization for Sector 12?" "Granted. Activate signal intercepts and initiate orbital tracking protocols." The Overseer stared at the frozen image of the local lifeform. If the primitive species had concealed a secret arsenal, the Empire would simply root it out and dismantle it. The matter would be resolved by morning. Then a secondary alert chimed across the lower deck. A second operations officer turned from his terminal, his expression deeply confused. "Commander," he hesitated, his eyes scanning a fresh data stream. "There has been another incident." The room paused. "Location?" "A southern continental occupation sector, Commander." Another casualty projection opened on the auxiliary wall. 3 dead. Total shield failure. Unknown. Deep metallic trauma. The survivors were reporting the exact same variables: a loud mechanical boom, heavy smoke, and instant projectile impact. The Overseer's brow furrowed. "How many secret operators are deploying these weapons?" The answer arrived quietly from the terminal. "One civilian, sir." A suffocating silence settled over the room. Then another alert chimed. A southern continental occupation sector, then a northern frozen region settlement cluster, then an eastern coastal population zone, then another dense urban corridor, then a western continental sector. One after another, the warning klaxons began to compete. The command chamber filled with a dizzying mosaic of ground footage from entirely different cities, featuring different locals and different weapons. Some were small, compact, hand-sized metallic frames. Others were long, structured from polished wood and heavy steel. Some were held by elderly persons on rooftops, others by armored municipal police, some by hunters emerging from dense foliage, and others by ordinary civilians standing on their own front lawns. Every single recording ended with the exact same violent, mechanical crack. Smoke. Shield collapse. Dead Andromedans. The room became increasingly, terribly quiet. The Overseer stared at the rapidly expanding tactical display. "What weapon system is this?" he asked slowly. "What is its designation?" Then, after a long pause, something unexpected followed. "And what species is this?" Several officers froze, their tendrils hanging motionless. For the first time since entering the Milky Way, the Supreme Tactical Overseer had bothered to ask. Until now, planets had been territories, populations, obstacles. Their inhabitants blurred together into the same forgettable pattern of surrender and collapse. The Empire conquered worlds, not species. But this primitive planet had become irritatingly specific. The Overseer looked again toward the frozen images spread across the chamber. Elderly civilians, hunters, municipal officers, ordinary figures standing calmly behind impossible weapons. "What are these natives called?" The senior systems analyst stepped forward, activating local planetary archives. "The planet is designated Earth by local population records, Commander." He hesitated. "The species identifies itself as humans." The name hung in the cold air, sinking into the silence until it felt permanently etched into the minds of everyone present. It was no longer just a designation, it was a warning. To break the quiet, the analyst stepped forward again, activating a comparative imaging matrix. Hundreds of recovered physical silhouettes rotated in the holographic air above the table, different shapes, different sizes, but carrying the exact same mechanical profile. Chemical residue, solid mass projectiles, combustion discharges, brutally primitive construction. The analyst swallowed hard. "The weapons appear to be structurally related, Commander." "Related?" "Yes, sir. They seem to be variations of the exact same basic platform." A commander frowned deeply. "Are you telling me this primitive world possesses thousands of variations of a shield-piercing superweapon?" The analyst hesitated, looking down at his terminal, then quietly, "No, Commander." The Overseer exhaled quietly. For the first time in several minutes, some of the tension in the room eased. A few hundred hidden weapons, manageable, containable. But the analyst couldn't look away from his terminal. His fingers froze over the keys as the wide-spectrum scan began to return a climbing planetary counter. He had prayed it would stop at 1,000, then at 10,000. But the digits kept blurring, rolling over relentlessly, while the pale glow of the screen reflected the growing horror on his face. The counter finally locked. 173.5 million. The relief died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The Overseer turned slowly, the tendrils framing his face, going still as his eyes locked onto the analyst.
"Millions?"
The room shifted uneasily, the quiet murmur of the staff dying out instantly as the true scale of the planetary registry began to sink in. The Overseer stared at the final glowing sum. "Military stockpiles." The analyst now looked physically ill. "No, sir." The Overseer blinked once, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "No. They are entirely civilian infrastructure." Someone in the back tier let out a short, confused laugh, not out of amusement but absolute disbelief. "What does civilian mean in this context?" a strategist demanded. "What is the strategic purpose?" "Private ownership," the analyst explained, his voice shaking. "The individual population. They simply own them." The commander's frown deepened. "Clarify private ownership. For planetary defense? Sometimes. For mandatory militia service? No, sir. For a structured military reserve? No." The analyst looked deeply unhappy, staring at the translation matrix. The primary registry lists the activity as hobby. Another silence blanketed the room. The Overseer stared, the words refusing to compute. "Are you telling me this planet's species casually carries super weapons and calls it a hobby?" A long, suffocating pause stretched across the chamber. Nobody dared to breathe. The Overseer leaned forward on his digitigrade legs, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What did you say the name of this species again?" The room remained frozen, the word humans still weighing heavily in the air as the analyst frantically tapped at his console. For the next few days, the command deck of the Ascendancy of Order did not sleep. The initial shock gave way to a desperate, high-tempo scientific mobilization. Teams of Imperial physicists, defensive engineers, and shieldwrights were brought in to analyze the telemetry, running thousands of diagnostic simulations on the personal and vehicle shield grids. They calibrated, they adjusted the phase frequencies, they shifted the plasma density of the barriers, they ran field test after field test against the captured kinetic data. Nothing worked. The heavy, leaden slugs of Earth's projectile weapons continued to punch through the Imperial energy barriers in field tests, as if the shields weren't even there. Finally, the lead systems analyst stepped forward to the central table, looking physically exhausted. The pale blue tactical display cast deep shadows across his face as he brought up a new architectural schematic of their defensive technology. "Commander," the analyst began, his voice hollow, "we have completed the cross-examination of the kinetic telemetry. We finally understand why our barriers are failing." The Overseer did not turn from the rotating glass hollow of Earth. "Speak." "The shield grids of the Ascendancy are designed around technical superiority," the analyst explained, gesturing to a glowing wave-frequency diagram. "For 3 millennia, galactic warfare has evolved around plasma, directed energy, and localized quantum disruptions. Our shields are hyper-advanced, built specifically to catch, disperse, and neutralize high-velocity energy signatures. They are so advanced, in fact—" The analyst swallowed hard, staring at the primitive mechanical profile of a human bullet. A look of quiet anguish crossed his face. "That they do not even register old Earth weapons as a threat. Commander, these are kinetic projectiles, solid mass combustion firearms." A sharp, collective intake of breath rippled across the strategic tier. The room went entirely rigid as the data took hold. The analyst expanded the broader Milky Way historical archives. This exact category of ballistics was officially declared obsolete nearly 1,000 years ago. It was dismissed by every civilized star system as a brute force relic of a forgotten era. Nobody in this galaxy uses it. Nobody even considers it. He looked back at the growing casualty reports from Earth. Yet these stubborn humans never truly abandoned it. A strategist's cranial ridges drew together, his face twisting. "Explain that absurdity. How does an obsolete antiquity bypass our frontline defenses?" "The system's automated threat recognition algorithms filter out low-velocity debris to conserve power," the analyst said, his hands trembling slightly against the console. "To our armor, a human projectile looks like a stray pebble or a piece of harmless atmospheric dust. It lacks the thermal and energetic signature required to trigger a defensive phase shift. By the time the physical mass impacts the solid emitter, it is already too late." The Overseer's eyes narrowed. "Then recalibrate the algorithms. Lower the activation threshold to include solid mass combustion projectiles." "We tried, Commander," the analyst replied, his voice dropping to a whisper, "but the math is rigid. If we recalibrate our current shield grids to recognize objects that primitive, the barriers become entirely unstable. The computational lag would make our vessels and infantry utterly vulnerable to standard current Milky Way tech. We would protect ourselves from the primitives below, only to leave our entire fleet completely defenseless against any conventional Milky Way military." The command deck's usual chatter disappeared. The Empire's entire doctrine of conquest was built upon an unbroken chain of technological dominance. Now that very sophistication had become a cage. Before the Overseer could reply, the lazy flash of the strobe suddenly broke into a frantic, high-pitched chime, then another. Within seconds, a chorus of red alarms saturated the secondary tactical deck, drowning the chamber in an oppressive, pulsing crimson glow. The operations staff scrambled, their fingers flying across terminals as fresh, frantic data streams began pouring onto the main displays. "Commander!" the tracking officer shouted, his voice cracking under sudden panic. "We have multiple asset anomalies. It is not just Sector 4. We are losing telemetry across the entire Western Hemisphere." The Overseer stepped toward the central table, his jaw tightened. "Are the vessels being destroyed?" "No, Commander," the officer gasped, staring at a rapidly multiplying wall of system alerts. They are broadcasting active, valid Imperial authentication signals, but their vectors are entirely wrong. They are moving against our own positions. The realization hit the High Command like a physical blow. The room fell into a horrified stillness as the pieces finally connected. For the past few days, while the Empire's greatest scientific minds had been entirely consumed on the command deck, running endless diagnostics, field tests, and simulations to counter the humans' kinetic firearms, the human population hadn't just been resisting on the ground. They had been quietly, systematically stealing the fleet. What the High Command had assumed were lost. Unrecoverable wrecks or isolated communication failures were actually successful boarding actions. The primitives had treated the Empire's distraction as an open invitation. And just like the ground skirmishes, the military telemetry revealed that ordinary civilians were playing key roles in the hijacking, working side by side with remnant Earth soldiers to hotwire, crossphase, and pilot the hyper-advanced warships. "Playback incoming feed from Sector 7, a strategist ordered frantically. "The atmospheric defense line is collapsing." The primary holographic display flickered, resolving into grainy ground telemetry from a coastal urban district. An Andromedan heavy drop vessel was cutting through the low clouds, maintaining a steady patrol sweep. Suddenly, the camera tracked downward to a human-built paved pathway. Emerging from behind a shattered structure was a massive, angular chunk of dense terrestrial metal. It did not hover. It sat heavily upon massive interconnected treads, driven by chained wheels, groaning under pure mechanical weight. Protruding from the front of this armored behemoth was a single, long, hollow tube. The strategic tier watched in absolute bewilderment as the tube erupted. There was no plasma charging sequence, no energy buildup, just a blinding chemical flash and a concussive shockwave that shattered the windows of every civilian structure for a block. It was another kinetic projectile. The humans had deployed a weapon utilizing the exact same combustion-based mass acceleration platform they used in their handheld weapons, but scaled up to a monstrous, impossible magnitude, firing a solid lead and iron slug nearly 100 times bigger directly into the sky. The projectile struck the ascending drop vessel dead center. To the bitter, agonized frustration of the command deck, it went exactly as their data predicted. The hyper-advanced shield grid ignored the massive low-energy kinetic mass entirely. The strategic tier could only watch in helpless torment as the giant slug slammed directly into the ship's primary thruster manifold. The vessel erupted into a ball of flame, spinning violently out of control before crashing heavily into the terrain below. The footage froze on the smoking wreckage of the Imperial ship. Standing atop the treaded metal monstrosity, a human civilian in a bright, high-visibility labor vest raised a fist into the air, shouting in triumph. The overseer stared at the screen, the cold realization settling into his bones. "What is that vehicle?" a commander asked, his voice shaking. "Another elite planetary defense platform? A hidden military asset?" The analyst, looking as though he had completely given up on logic, tapped his console with a trembling hand to read the local registration data. "No, Commander," the analyst whispered, his face completely pale under the red emergency lights. According to local historical archives, it is a relic, a retired combat tank. Somehow, a human civilian owned a tank. The frustration on the overseer's face was now bare, stripped of all imperial dignity. For the first time in his decades of command, his hands trembled, not with fear, but with a blind, suffocating rage. His tendrils flared and writhed uncontrollably. He slammed his fist onto the central console, shattering the blue holographic glass. "If we cannot pacify this primitive rock, then we will leave it as ash. Deploy the Calum Fractor." The strategic tier stiffened. The Worldbreaker, a cataclysmic orbital platform designed to ignite a planet's atmosphere and boil its oceans. It was an extreme measure of absolute finality, a weapon reserved exclusively for desperate cases and species that refused to break. The logistical cost to construct and prime it was astronomically high, rendering the platform a single-use asset that consumed itself entirely upon firing. Using it meant admitting tactical failure. "Acknowledged, Commander," the subordinate replied, turning sharply to the lower operations tier. "Sections 4 through 9 initiate the prime sequence. Open the stellar containment baffles and engage the solar core siphon." Across the secondary deck, technicians threw physical master switches. On the primary display, the Calum Fractor, a colossal ringed silhouette of black iron, began its agonizingly slow descent into the upper atmosphere. The orbital schematic updated in real time as the weapon entered low orbit, its central focal core beginning to glow with a brilliant, blinding plasma charge. "Orbit locked," the subordinate called out over the rising mechanical roar. "Atmospheric ignition grid is stabilizing. Weapon capacity at 12% and climbing." A sharp, deafening error klaxon cut the subordinate off mid-sentence, shattering the rhythm of the build-up. The central display did not show a charging sequence. Instead, the orbital schematic of the Calum Fractor was flashing a violent, terminal crimson. "Report!" the overseer roared. "What is the obstruction?" "Commander," the analyst choked out, staring at the telemetry in utter disbelief. The platform is under heavy fire. It is being systematically targeted." The overseer's rage froze into a sudden, icy dread. "By whom? What military remnant managed to launch an atmospheric counter-offensive?" "No military remnant, sir," the analyst whispered, the pale light of the dying terminal reflecting off his wide eyes. "It is our own ships. The captured corvettes, the stolen heavy transports, they are firing on the platform." The implications spread across the chamber in seconds, leaving even the most seasoned officers staring blankly at their displays. The humans hadn't just been blindly hoarding the Empire's technology. They had anticipated this exact escalation. Millennia of brutal internal planetary warfare, centuries of blood-soaked history before they ever achieved a fragile global peace, had taught mankind a single, unyielding truth about conquerors. When a tyrant loses the ground, he burns the valley. The overseer's eyes drifted toward the orbital targeting grids. A cold realization crawled through him. This primitive species wasn't just reacting to his invasion. They were playing chess, and they had already mapped out his next move. They must have been actively hunting for the Calum Fractor's unique energy signature, waiting for the Empire to blink. The moment his crew initiated the prime sequence, the massive power surge had lit up the human sensor grids like a beacon. They knew the exact coordinates before the weapon could even clear its baffles. They had simply been waiting for him to reach for it. On the main screen, the sleek, silver hulls of 3 hijacked Andromedan corvettes cut through the upper atmosphere in a flawless, terrifying delta formation. They didn't move with the rigid, predictable rhythms of Imperial doctrine. They flew with a chaotic, aggressive fluidity, the terrifying signature of human improvisation. A final, desperate communication intercept from the platform flashed onto the console's text matrix, translated into the clinical language of the Empire, but carrying a chilling, primitive finality. It was a broadcast sent from the human forces to the entire orbital fleet right before the Calum Fractor collapsed into a ball of falling starfire. The text read, "We conquered our own planet before we met you. You only brought us better weapons." The overseer watched in absolute silence as the burning remnants of the Empire's greatest superweapon rained down upon the atmosphere of Earth like shooting stars. There was no victory to be engineered here, no technical superiority left to leverage. Only the crushing, bitter weight of a defeat that would stain his name forever. "Recall the perimeter," he commanded, the burning taste of shame heavy on his tongue. His voice barely a whisper against the fading klaxons. "Signal the remaining vessels. We are leaving orbit." Not a single subordinate or analyst spoke a word. There were no requests for clarification, no tactical objections, and no hesitation. In absolute, hollow silence, their fingers moved across the keys, instantly executing the retreat. They simply wanted to be gone. Within minutes, the fractured remnants of the invasion fleet turned their prows away from the blue planet. fleeing into the dark expanse of the void. And somewhere below, on the primitive world they had dismissed as prey, humanity finished teaching the Empire a lesson no conquest species had ever needed to learn. War did not always become more advanced. Sometimes, war became primitive again. The news of the Andromedan defeat did not travel through official channels. It fractured across the galactic network like an impossible signal, radiating outward from a single, unremarkable star system. At first, the core worlds refused to believe it. Earth, a solitary, isolated system on the galactic rim, had not just survived an imperial pacification, they had broken the vanguard. Then, humanity began to broadcast. They did not transmit victory speeches, nor did they broadcast celebrations. They transmitted instructions. Cascading streams of raw data flooded every open frequency in the sector. Mechanical blueprint schematics for crude, chemical-fueled firearms, precise structural analyses on energy shield penetration limits, and unedited helmet cam footage of Imperial retreats. They uploaded step-by-step guides on how to survive an urban occupation, and precise anatomical breakdowns detailing exactly how to kill an Andromedan soldier with industrial scrap. Beneath the endless data streams, a human voice looped continuously across the long-range galactic frequencies. Their defensive matrices evolved to stop advanced weapons, so stop being advanced. Occupied worlds across the galaxy listened. In the dark corners of subjugated planets, dormant manufacturing plants quietly restarted their assembly lines. Private collectors opened forgotten historical vaults. Regular civilians armed themselves with whatever heavy, unaccelerated mass they could forge, and broken planetary militaries adapted old-world insurgent tactics. Across the occupied galaxy, worlds began following the blueprint of victory humanity had broadcast from Earth. And slowly, with agonizing humiliation, the Andromedan Empire began losing its grip on the galaxy. Centuries later, long after the borders of the Empire had receded into history, galactic scholars would summarize Earth's true legacy in a single, definitive sentence. Humanity proved that the most dangerous weapon is the one everyone stopped preparing for. The shooting range looked entirely different than it had during the dark, smoke-choked days of the invasion. The walls had been completely rebuilt, the lighting was crisp and bright, and the automated target lanes ran smooth and clean. Above the reinforced entrance, a freshly painted sign hung proudly under the street lamps. The Range, 702, the Andromedan Humbler. The facility was packed. The sharp, rhythmic cracks of gunfire echoed off the acoustic paneling, punctuated by the low rumble of laughter between lanes and instructors barking familiar corrections. Spent brass casings clinked and scattered across the polished concrete floor, and the heavy, nostalgic scent of gun oil and burned powder drifted thick through the air. Jim leaned casually against the wooden partition of Lane 4, a relaxed smirk playing on his face as he watched the shooter beside him. Across the divider, Selvin stood tall, wearing heavy-duty earmuffs and a pair of yellow-tinted safety glasses that still looked faintly ridiculous on his pointed-eared, non-human face. In his hands rested a brand-new M1911, its polished steel gleaming beneath the range lights. He raised the pistol, took a measured breath, and squeezed the trigger. The gun barked. A crisp paper target downrange shuddered, dead center. Selvin lowered the weapon slowly, his jaws tightening as he set it down on the bench. "I still find this entire process deeply uncivilized," he declared, his translator filtering the alien syllables into a flat, formal cadence. Jim snorted, crossing his arms. "You just put a hole through a 3-inch bullseye from 20 yards away, Selvin." "It is unnecessarily loud," Selvin countered, though he picked the heavy pistol back up and aligned his sights again. Another concussive crack shattered the lane, another perfect tear in the paper. "And the mechanical recoil is remarkably unpleasant." Jim raised an eyebrow. "You already own a Remington 870, an M1 Garand, and a Winchester. At this point, you're one revolver away from being a cowboy." Selvin ignored the jab entirely. Whatever a cowboy was, he had no intention of giving Jim the satisfaction of explaining it. I am merely conducting a practical appreciation of primitive ballistic engineering. Right. Keep telling yourself that, Jim laughed, shaking his head. For a long moment, both men stood quietly in the lane, letting the familiar noise of the range wash over them. Outside the reinforced concrete walls, the city of Chicago was bustling, alive, and entirely free. Selvin glanced away from his target, looking down the long row of shooting bays. He watched civilians practicing alongside scarred veterans, hobbyists trading tips with curious tourists, and collectors carefully cleaning century-old steel. The alien shook his head slowly, a gesture he had picked up from his time on the surface. "You know," he said quietly, his voice dropping below the ambient roar of the room. "The high councils on the core worlds still debate the sheer absurdity of how humanity broke the occupation." Jim's smirk widened. "Oh yeah. What's the consensus?" "The strategists credit your military brilliance," Selvin replied, slipping a fresh magazine into the grip of his pistol. "The analysts cite your rapid physiological adaptability and asymmetrical logistics." He gestured with the heavy iron weapon toward the crowded room around them. "And yet the true catalyst began here." Jim looked down the lane, watching the paper targets sway under the fluorescent lights. "Sometimes old stuff sticks around for a reason, pal. Progress doesn't always mean throwing out what works." Selvin considered the words, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the steel in his palm. He racked the slide, chambering another round with a mechanical snap. "Yes," the alien said softly, aligning his sights with the center of the target once more. "And sometimes a civilization survives simply because its people refuse to clean out their closets." Selvin squeezed the trigger. The ancient design barked once more. Somewhere across the galaxy, an Andromedan historian would later describe it as the sound that ended an empire.